3 sisters were being sold by their father, 2 cowboys changed their fate forever. The dust devils danced like demons across the town square that morning, swirling dirt into the eyes of anyone fool enough to look up at the cloudless sky. Thomas Brennan stood on the makeshift wooden platform, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the piece of paper that would damn his soul forever. The words were written in his own blood-stained ink, each letter a nail in his coffin of shame. His 3 daughters huddled together on the platform beside him like frightened sparrows. Mary, the eldest at 19, wrapped her arms around her younger sisters as if she could shield them from what was coming. Her green eyes held the kind of terror that comes when childhood dies in a single moment. 16-year-old Sarah pressed her face against Mary's shoulder, her auburn hair catching the merciless sun like fire. Little Emma, barely 14, clutched a cornhusk doll with one arm missing, the same arm she'd lost in the accident that started their father's drinking. The crowd gathered below them like vultures sensing death. Ranchers with tobacco-stained teeth leered up at the girls. Miners fresh from the gold fields counted coins in their dirty palms. A preacher stood at the back, his Bible closed, his eyes fixed on Sarah's trembling form. Even the saloon girls had come to witness this unholy spectacle, their painted faces twisted with disgust and pity. Thomas cleared his throat, and the sound cut through the morning air like a death rattle. The paper crumpled in his grip as he read words that tasted like poison on his tongue. Due to debts owed to Mr. Cornelius Hawk in the amount of $800, I hereby offer my daughters Mary, Sarah, and Emma Brennan for. His voice broke like a dam giving way to flood waters. Mary squeezed her sisters tighter, feeling their hearts beating against her ribs like trapped birds. She'd known this day might come ever since their mother died of fever 2 winters ago. Ever since their father started spending his nights at Hawk's gambling tables, throwing away their future one poker hand at a time. She'd watched him sell their horse, their plow, their mother's wedding ring. But she never imagined he'd sell them. For immediate adoption and care, Thomas finally whispered, the lie burning his throat. Everyone knew what he really meant. Everyone knew what these men wanted from his daughters. A rancher named Bull Morrison stepped forward, his belt buckle straining against his massive belly. I'll give you $50 for the little one, he called out, pointing at Emma with a finger thick as a sausage. She looks like she'd make a fine kitchen help. The crowd chuckled, and the sound made Mary's skin crawl. Kitchen help. As if anyone believed that's what Bull Morrison wanted with a 14-year-old girl. 60 for the redhead, shouted a voice from the back. Sarah flinched as if struck, her tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. Thomas closed his eyes, but the bidding continued around him like the buzzing of flies over carrion. 70. 80. 100. The numbers rose with each cruel laugh, each hungry stare. His daughters weren't daughters anymore. They were merchandise. Livestock. The weight of what he'd done pressed down on his shoulders like a gravestone. Emma's cornhusk doll fell from her trembling fingers and landed in the dirt below the platform. The missing arm seemed to point accusingly at her father, and Thomas felt his knees buckle. This was what whiskey and desperation had made of him. This was what $800 of debt had cost his family. Mary watched her sister's doll disappear under the boots of the bidding crowd, and something cold as winter settled in her chest. She'd always been the strong one, the one who held their family together when their father came home reeking of failure and cheap liquor. But standing on that platform with strange men arguing over their worth like they were cattle at market, she felt something inside her break that might never heal. The sun climbed higher, turning the wooden platform into a furnace. Sweat mixed with tears on the girls' faces as the bidding grew more frenzied. A merchant offered $150 for all 3. A cattle baron countered with $200. Thomas opened his eyes and saw the faces of his daughters, saw the way they looked at him like he was already dead to them. And maybe he was. The crowd pressed closer, their voices rising like the baying of wild dogs. Mary felt Sarah's hand slip into hers, felt Emma's small fingers grasp her skirt. They were clinging to her because she was all they had left in a world that had suddenly turned savage. But what could she do? She was 19 years old with calloused hands and a heart full of love that meant nothing to men who saw her as property. That's when she heard the sound that would change everything, the creak of leather saddles and the jingle of spurs as two riders approached from the edge of town. The crowd turned to look, their bidding momentarily forgotten as the strangers dismounted and tied their horses to the hitching post with practiced ease. Mary squinted through her tears and saw them clearly for the first time. Two cowboys, dust-covered and trail-worn, with the kind of eyes that had seen too much of the world's darkness. One was tall and lean with silver threading his dark hair. The other was younger, broader, with scars across his knuckles that spoke of hard-won fights. They moved with the quiet confidence of men who'd learned to survive on their own terms. The crowd parted as the strangers approached the platform, their boots marking steady rhythm against the packed earth. Thomas looked down at them with the desperate hope of a drowning man reaching for driftwood, but these weren't the kind of men who usually attended his daughter's auction. These were different. Dangerous. The tall one tipped his hat to the girls, and Mary saw something in his eyes that made her heart skip, not hunger like the others, but something closer to rage. The younger cowboy's hand rested near his gun, his jaw clenched tight as granite. They'd come to bid on the Brennan sisters. But as Mary watched them study the crowd with predatory focus, she realized they might have come for something else entirely. Jack Sullivan had seen plenty of ugly things in his 43 years riding the frontier trails. He'd witnessed range wars that painted the grass red with blood. He'd watched good men turn savage over water rights and bad men prosper while honest folk starved. But standing at the edge of that town square, watching a father auction off his daughters like prize horses, something twisted in his gut that made him want to put his fist through someone's face. His riding partner, Cole Masterson, stood beside him with murder in his eyes. At 31, Cole had already lived through more violence than most men see in a lifetime, but his scarred knuckles were trembling with barely controlled rage. "Jesus Christ, Jack," he whispered, his voice thick with disgust. "Look at those girls. Look at their faces." Jack didn't need to look again. He'd seen enough in that first glance to burn the image into his memory forever. Three sisters clutching each other on a wooden platform while grown men bid on them like they were cattle. The oldest one trying to be brave for her sisters, the middle one weeping into her hands, the youngest one lost and broken with her doll lying trampled in the dirt. "That's Brennan up there," Cole said, recognizing the man from the saloons. "Thomas Brennan. Heard he owed Hawk money, but this." He shook his head, unable to finish the sentence. Jack knew Cornelius Hawk by reputation, a lone shark who dressed like a gentleman but had the soul of a rattlesnake. Hawk owned half the businesses in 3 counties and wasn't particular about how he collected his debts. But using a man's daughters as collateral crossed a line that even the frontier's loose morals shouldn't tolerate. The bidding grew louder, more frenzied. Bull Morrison was up to $200 now, his pig eyes fixed on little Emma with the kind of hunger that made Jack's skin crawl. A cattle baron named Thornfield countered with $250. The preacher in the back had started moving closer to the platform, his Bible clutched in white-knuckled hands. "We can't just stand here," Cole muttered, his hand drifting toward his gun. "We can't let this happen." Jack's jaw tightened as he watched Mary Brennan wrap her arms tighter around her sisters. The girl had grit, he could see it in the set of her shoulders, the way she held her head high despite the tears streaming down her face. She reminded him of someone he'd lost long ago, someone who'd faced down impossible odds with nothing but courage and love. "How much money you got?" Jack asked quietly. Cole patted his saddlebags. "About 300 from that cattle drive in Abilene." "You?" "Same. Maybe a little more." Jack's mind was racing, calculating numbers and risks. $600 was more than most of these men made in a year, but was it enough? And even if they could outbid everyone else, what then? What did 2 drifters do with 3 terrified girls and a town full of angry men who'd been cheated out of their prize? The bidding hit 300. Bull Morrison wiped sweat from his forehead and raised it to 320. The cattle baron hesitated, counting coins in his palm. The crowd sensed blood in the water, their voices rising like the howl of coyotes. Jack watched Thomas Brennan's face crumble as his daughter's worth climbed higher. The man looked like he wanted to throw himself off that platform and let the desert sand bury his shame. But debt was debt on the frontier, and Hawk's men stood at the edges of the crowd like vultures, making sure no one forgot who really owned this spectacle. 350. Bull Morrison bellowed, his voice carrying across the square like thunder. That's when Cole Masterson stepped forward, his spurs jingling against the packed earth. The crowd turned to look at him, this stranger with scars on his hands and steel in his eyes. He pulled a leather pouch from his saddlebags and held it high enough for everyone to see. $400, he called out, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. The square fell silent except for the whisper of wind through the wooden buildings. Bull Morrison's mouth fell open, showing teeth like yellow corn kernels. The cattle baron took a step back, suddenly aware that he was outgunned. Even the preacher stopped moving, his eyes fixed on Cole with something between relief and suspicion. Jack stepped up beside his partner, his own money pouch in hand. "And I've got another 200 on top of that," he announced. 600 total. For all three girls. Mary Brennan's green eyes found his across the crowd, and Jack saw something flicker there, not just hope, but recognition. She understood somehow that these weren't buyers like the others. These were something different. Something dangerous. Thomas Brennan stared down at them with his mouth working soundlessly, like a fish pulled from water. $600 would clear his debt with Hawk and leave him with 200 to spare. It was more money than he'd dreamed of seeing today. But these strangers weren't offering to adopt his daughters or provide them with honest work. They were offering to buy them outright, and something in their eyes suggested they had their own plans. Bull Morrison found his voice first. "Now hold on there, strangers. This here's a local matter. You boys don't even know these girls." Cole's hand moved to rest on his gun grip, the motion casual but unmistakable. "Don't reckon that's any of your business, friend. Money's money, and ours spends as good as anyone's." The crowd stirred restlessly, sensing the shift in power. These weren't local men with reputations to protect and neighbors to answer to. These were drifters, gunmen, the kind who rode into town and rode out again without leaving forwarding addresses. The kind who might do anything. Jack stepped closer to the platform, his eyes never leaving Thomas Brennan's face. $600, cash money. Right here, right now. That's our final offer. Sarah Brennan lifted her face from her hands, hope and terror warring in her expression. Emma looked up at her sisters with confusion, not understanding why strangers would pay so much for them when their own father was willing to sell them so cheap. The silence stretched like a bowstring pulled to breaking. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, and the sound echoed across the square like a funeral dirge. Thomas Brennan looked at his daughters one last time, then nodded to the men who just bought their freedom. Or their doom. Nobody knew which yet. The money changed hands like a pact signed in blood. Jack counted out the $800 in silver while Hawk's pale eyes watched every coin, his thin smile never wavering. The crowd pressed closer, their earlier excitement curdling into something darker as they realized their entertainment was ending. Thomas Brennan took the money with shaking hands, but his eyes wouldn't meet his daughters' faces. Cole helped the three sisters down from the platform, his movements gentle despite the tension crackling through the air like lightning before a storm. Mary's legs nearly buckled when her feet touched solid ground, but she forced herself to stand straight. Sarah clung to her arm while Emma picked up her broken doll from the dust, cradling it against her chest like it might still offer comfort. "Our horses are at the livery stable," Jack said quietly, his eyes never leaving Hawk's gun hands. "We'll collect some supplies and be on our way. No trouble for anyone." But Hawk's chuckle suggested otherwise. Oh, I'm afraid it's not quite that simple, Mr. Sullivan. You see, these girls have been educated in certain expectations. Their new owner might want to inspect his purchase before taking possession. The words hit Mary like a physical blow. She understood now what kind of education Hawk meant, what kind of expectations these men had planned for her and her sisters. Her stomach twisted with revulsion and fear. Cole's hand dropped to his gun. The transaction's complete. The girls are coming with us. Right now. Actually, Hawk said, his voice smooth as snake oil, I think perhaps we should. He never finished the sentence. Jack's Colt appeared in his hand with the speed of desert lightning, its barrel pointing steadily at Hawk's chest. Cole's weapon cleared leather a heartbeat later, covering the two gun hands who'd started their own draws. The girls are leaving, Jack said, his voice carrying the authority of sudden death. Anyone who disagrees is welcome to state their objection. For a moment that felt like eternity, the town square balanced on the edge of a massacre. Hawk's men had their hands on their guns but hadn't cleared leather. The crowd scattered like tumbleweeds in a dust devil, seeking cover behind water troughs and wooden posts. Even Bull Morrison backed away, his earlier bravado evaporating in the face of drawn iron. Then Hawk smiled and raised his hands in mock surrender. Of course, gentlemen. Business is business. Take your purchases and go with God's blessing. But his pale eyes promised a different kind of blessing entirely. Jack backed toward the livery stable, keeping his gun trained on Hawk while Cole herded the sisters ahead of them. Mary's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized these strangers had just declared war on one of the most dangerous men in 3 counties. They'd bought her freedom with more than money, they'd paid for it with their lives. At the stable, Cole threw saddles on their horses with practiced speed while Jack kept watch. The sisters huddled together near the stalls, their eyes wide with terror and something that might have been hope. Mary noticed that Cole's hands never shook despite the danger, that Jack's breathing stayed steady even with death stalking them like wolves. Can you girls ride? Jack asked as Cole led out 2 additional horses, a bay mare and a gray gelding that looked sturdy enough for the trail ahead. Some, Mary answered for them all. They'd ridden their father's plow horse before he'd sold it, but these were different animals entirely. These were horses bred for speed and endurance, for outrunning trouble across unforgiving terrain. Cole boosted Emma onto the bay mare, then helped Sarah onto the gelding. Mary swung herself onto the mare behind Emma, wrapping her arms around her youngest sister. The broken doll was still clutched in Emma's hands, its missing arm a reminder of all the broken things they were leaving behind. They rode out of town at a steady trot, Jack and Cole flanking the sisters like protective wolves. The desert stretched ahead of them, endless red rocks and scattered sagebrush baking under a sun that showed no mercy. But behind them, Mary could hear the sound she'd been dreading, hoofbeats following at a distance, keeping pace but staying out of rifle range. They're coming, she whispered to Jack. His jaw tightened. I know. Hawk doesn't like to lose. The chase began in earnest as they crested the first ridge. Hawk's men had mounted up, 6 riders spread out in a line, their horses fresh while Jack and Cole's animals had already covered 20 miles that morning. The sisters' mounts were borrowed from the livery stable, unknown quantities that might falter when the real running began. Cole looked back at their pursuers and cursed under his breath. They've got us outnumbered and outgunned. We need to find shelter, somewhere to make a stand. Ghost Canyon's about 10 miles north, Jack replied, spurring his horse into a faster gait. If we can reach it before they catch us, we might have a chance. Sarah's horse stumbled on loose shale, and for a heart-stopping moment Mary thought her sister might fall. But the gelding recovered its footing and kept running, foam beginning to fleck its neck as the pace increased. Emma's doll finally fell from her grasp, tumbling into the dust to join all the other broken things they'd left behind. The first gunshot cracked across the desert like thunder, the bullet whining off a rock 20 yards to their left. Mary pressed herself lower against the bay mare's neck, feeling Emma's small body trembling in her arms. This was what freedom cost: bullets and blood, and the terrible possibility that salvation might be just another word for death. Behind them, Hawk's men were closing the distance, their fresh horses eating up ground while their prey struggled across the broken terrain. The chase had become a race against time itself, with the desert watching like a jury waiting to render its final verdict. Ghost Canyon opened before them like the Earth's own secret, its red walls rising 200 feet into the merciless sky. Jack led them through a narrow passage barely wide enough for horses, the sound of hoofbeats echoing off stone like gunshots in a cathedral. Behind them, Hawk's men had fallen back, unwilling to follow strangers into terrain that could become their tomb. The canyon floor was carpeted with wildflowers that bloomed despite the harsh soil, purple lupin and yellow desert marigolds that seemed to mock the violence of the chase. A spring bubbled up from underground, creating a small oasis where cottonwood trees offered the first shade the sisters had seen in hours. Emma slipped from the bay mare and collapsed beside the water, cupping handfuls to her cracked lips. Mary helped Sarah dismount, her own legs shaking from exhaustion and terror. They'd ridden 15 miles at breakneck speed, bullets whistling past their heads like angry wasps. Now they were safe, at least temporarily, in this hidden sanctuary that existed like a miracle in the middle of nowhere. Jack and Cole positioned themselves at the canyon mouth, rifles ready, watching for any sign of pursuit. The desert beyond shimmered with heat waves, but no dust clouds marked approaching riders. Hawk's men had given up the chase, at least for now. Why? Mary asked suddenly, her voice cracking with emotion. Why did you help us? You don't even know our names. Jack turned from his sentinel position, and she saw something in his weathered face that made her heart skip. Pain. Old pain that had carved lines around his eyes and taught him the weight of regret. Had a sister once, he said quietly. About your age when bad men took her. I couldn't save her then. Cole's scarred hands gentled as he helped Emma wash the dust from her face. Every man's got ghosts following him out here, he added. Sometimes you get a chance to do something right. Sometimes you don't. The sisters spent that first night learning their rescuers' stories. Jack had been a lawman once, before politics and corruption drove him from his badge. Cole had fought in range wars that left him wealthy in scars and poor in everything else. They were drifters now, men without homes or families, carrying their past like stones in their saddlebags. What happens now? Sarah whispered as the stars emerged overhead like scattered diamonds. Where do we go? There's a settlement 3 days north, Jack replied, feeding mesquite branches to their small fire. Good people. Families who'll take you in, help you start over. But Mary shook her head. We can't keep running. Hawk will find us eventually. Men like him always do. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls. In the distance, coyotes howled at the moon, their voices echoing off stone like the ghosts of all the dreams that had died in this unforgiving land. Emma had fashioned a new doll from twisted grass and cloth scraps, her child's resilience already rebuilding what violence had torn down. Over the following days, as they made their way toward the settlement, the sisters began to discover who they were beyond their father's shame. Mary revealed a sharp mind for figures and planning. Sarah showed skill with horses that impressed even Cole. Emma's laughter returned gradually, like water seeping into parched earth. The settlement of Haven Creek existed in a valley where the desert gave way to grassland. Families had carved homes from the wilderness through sheer determination and mutual aid. The sisters were welcomed with the kind of warmth that comes from people who understand survival requires community. Mary found work keeping books for the general store. Sarah helped at the livery stable, her way with horses earning respect and wages. Emma attended the small school, her broken doll replaced by new friends who didn't know or care about her past. Jack and Cole stayed long enough to see the sisters settled, then prepared to ride on. That's what drifters did, they helped where they could and moved on before their presence brought trouble to good people. But the night before their departure, Mary found Jack sitting alone by the creek that gave the settlement its name. "Thank you," she said simply, settling beside him on the grass. "For everything." His smile was sad and beautiful in the moonlight. "You don't need to thank us. You saved yourselves. We just gave you the chance. Will we see you again?" Jack looked up at the stars, the same stars that had witnessed their desperate flight across the desert. "Maybe. Frontier's a big place, but it's also small. Paths cross when they're supposed to." He was wrong about that. 3 years later, when Hawk finally tracked them down and came calling with hired guns and threats, Jack and Cole appeared like avenging angels riding out of a dust storm. The settlement stood together that day, every man and woman who'd made Haven Creek their home. Hawk's men found themselves outnumbered and outgunned by people who'd learned that some things were worth dying for. The sisters never learned the full details of what happened to Cornelius Hawk. Some said he left the territory in disgrace. Others whispered darker stories about unmarked graves in the desert. But they never saw him again, and that was all that mattered. Mary eventually married the settlement's doctor, a gentle man who loved her fierce heart and quiet strength. Sarah became the finest horse trainer in 3 counties, her reputation drawing buyers from as far as Denver. Emma grew up to be a teacher, her own children learning lessons about courage and kindness from their mother's broken doll, carefully repaired and treasured as a reminder of how broken things can be made whole. And sometimes, on clear desert nights when the stars seemed close enough to touch, the sisters would see 2 riders silhouetted against the horizon, guardians still watching over the lives they'd helped save, proof that some men are willing to die for strangers' freedom, and that redemption is always possible under the endless sky.